Well, before I go on a little bit, let me kind of try to recap some of the highlights that each of the speakers, plus Galen introducing the topic, has been covering. Why do we all as regulators care about this? It's a fascinating topic. It's interesting. Everybody likes to think about it and talk about it. And I'll echo what each of them have alluded to, because CPAs are in this space. They are issuing a test, examination opinions, agreed upon procedures. They're auditing systems. They're auditing every step of the way along this chain. And so if you haven't seen it yet in your State Board of Accountancy, you are going to see it at some point. It is a area that is poised for very, very fast growth. I don't know when the snowball is going to start, but it has started. And it just remains to be seen how long it's actually going to take hold before this becomes a very significant practice area, particularly for the larger firms. Mike noted the importance of these reports, the data integrity. I'll touch on that a bit myself, given my topic being the attest and verification part of today's agenda. And he also mentioned the plus sign, and that's how you know that there has been some form of external assurance on that. He also listed up, I loved that slide where there were a lot of logos from the companies that are issuing some form of corporate sustainability report. There's very, very few of those U.S. domiciled companies that actually have their full corporate sustainability report with an audit opinion. So something that we'd be more accustomed to seeing with a glossy financial statement along with that auditor's report in the beginning. We see very, very few of those here in the United States. And the reason I'm up here speaking to you today is that my firm does have a significant market share of the publicly held companies that do issue those types of reports, and I serve a number of those clients personally. So I've been doing this work for probably 7, 8 years now. And I can tell you, I've seen a big change compared to even just the last 2 or 3 years, where people are finally starting to talk about it and recognize that this is an area and a space that CPAs are getting into. Now, Sam covered quite a bit of this, as did Mike, about why the companies care. And in my mind, I don't want to repeat too much of what everybody's been saying, but I think that there's a wide variety here of what goes on. We do see the value set of the company and its leaders. So you can see it kind of goes from an altruistic motivation to do the right thing, whether that's truly the belief of the founders or the owners of the company or major stockholders, or whether people are doing it just for their employees or for other reasons that are caused by that. You also see that kind of going into, along the spectrum, maybe doing it for business purposes, managing risk, increasing profits, thinking, wow, if I do this, maybe I can sell a bit more, maybe I can capture that market share. And then you go all the way to the other end of the spectrum, where it is a supply chain vendor requirement, and this company is being forced to do it, and that they probably would not be doing it unless somebody that they were selling to, Costco and Walmart really come to mind here. They have very robust supply chain vendor requirements, code of conduct that they do require of all their primary vendors. So, you do wonder, and sometimes in those situations, would those companies have been publishing anything or providing that data if they weren't being forced to it? So you really see the spectrum here of why, the motivation for why these companies are doing it. But as Mike noted, it's really here to stay, and I do think that we will see the U.S. follow the rest of the globe here as far as these reports becoming more and more common. Now, being the CPA that I am, I had to have a flow chart in my presentation, and you'll see this again a little bit later at the end with some more things filled in. But I like this flow chart because it really shows, it's a good way to lay out and think of the different terminology and the different aspects of sustainability reporting. And when you look at that planet, people, profits, that's just another way of saying the economic, environmental, social. You'll hear that triple bottom line, and you'll hear these different catchphrases, but triple bottom line always comes back to these three kind of concepts of planet and environment, people and social, and then profits, and our typical economic or our model that we follow now with financial statements. So if you kind of follow down through the flow chart, I think we all understand the whole audited financial statements. We're used to regulating that. That's what we do. We've been doing that for a long time. It gets a little harder when you start talking about, are you going to regulate that CPA that's now issuing examination reports on people, on fair wage, diversity, community, the statistics around that? How are you going to regulate that CPA that's issuing a report on greenhouse gas emissions? And as somebody who signs my firm's name to a report auditing greenhouse gas emissions, I can tell you it's a little squishy. There's a lot of different criteria for greenhouse gas emissions, and I'm not an engineer, and I certainly don't have the training of a scientist that is really needed for many of this criteria. But that is happening today. So it's a lot to think about as far as where do those CPA services come into play for whether you're doing a supply chain work, codes of conduct, or the full corporate social responsibility reports attestation. Now here's just a sample list of some of the communications. Sam gave you a good rundown of how Boise Inc. puts together their corporate social responsibility report. You can certainly carve out pieces. We commonly see in our client base that they will carve out the greenhouse gas emissions sections, maybe not including that into the full CSR report. There are certain accreditation bodies throughout the world that accept those greenhouse gas emissions report and put valuation on them, give them accreditation set of standards. So oftentimes the companies will submit a separate GHG or greenhouse gas emission report to that body, which they also could choose to have audited separately. Code of conduct, again, very common. We don't see the CPAs in this space quite as much because this space is dominated by what I would call, this is my words, compliance checklist services. Perhaps an example of that would be a factory that the company has to prove to the vendor that they're up the supply chain that they're a safe factory. So they have to have a certain amount of fire exits. They have to have a certain amount of space between their factory floor. They have to have first aid. They have to have certain training for their employees. And so they have to certify to that. So there's a lot of companies out there that are just doing check, pass, fail. The check, pass, fail goes directly up the supply chain, and there's no report, there's no attestation, there's no, really a similar CPA service. So I predict that at some point we will start to see more CPAs moving into this space and issuing more of these robust reports. But at this point, we really see a lot more of just the pass, fail, and non-CPAs doing this type of work. Mike covered the integrated report. So I won't go into that. But really the first few items on this list are really the things that lend themselves more to the space that you'll see the CPAs in. A lot of companies have claims on their websites, product certifications. You do sometimes see verifications on that, as well as maybe the systems or the products that are leading up into the CSR report. So that's certainly an area. Sam alluded to that with the forest product area certification process is one example. But as we get into marketing materials and things like that, you're not going to see, it gets much more subjective and probably less likely to see CPAs in that area. Probably one of the most common when you are talking about supply chain requirements, and really the key components oftentimes noted in the corporate sustainability reports is the sourcing for products and the sourcing for ingredients and where those came from. There are a lot of entities such as Fair Trade, which is an entity that approves or certifies the assertions that the company is making behind those claims. So a CPA, for example, could send a confirmation to the Fair Trade entity as an audit procedure to get that assurance back on when a company is claiming that certain of their products may be fair trade. Now, I know both of the speakers had alluded to contractors, subcontractors, service providers. When you dig down into more of the Scope 2 and the Scope 3, as we call them. For example, for greenhouse gas emissions, you're really reaching out past your own company, and you're getting down into, you're going down the supply chain, or you're going down into providers and vendors to your own company. It gets a lot harder to audit. It gets much more difficult to be able to get the data to verify that. So that's an area that will be very interesting to see how that evolves and how the attestation around that becomes generally accepted, for lack of a better phrase. Now, as you can imagine, this area is complex. It is fairly subjective. There's a wide variety. We don't have agreed upon criteria, agreed upon standards. And what's interesting to me in this space is that oftentimes the accounting and finance department are not involved at all in pulling together the data, which is interesting because this, of course, is probably the most, the department in the company that is most used to robust internal control systems and pulling data out of those systems and then reporting on that data. But oftentimes it might be the HR department, it might be the sales and marketing department. Many companies now do have environmental or sustainability type departments that do lead this effort, and so hopefully there's some robustness when they have that type of department. But we often see a situation where there is a lack of robust internal control systems. And the way I like to explain it is if you should have just as robust of a system in your social claims or your environmental claims as you do for your payroll system. Because if an auditor is going to opine on that number, whether it's in the annual financial report that's on the financial statements or in the annual corporate sustainability report on social and environmental factors, there needs to be that level. And the auditor should apply that same level of assurance and fill up their assurance bucket to that same degree of quality. So that is something that I think we have a ways to go with respect to companies being able to produce reports in this area that are accurate. And there is a term called this, I think I heard Mike mention it. Greenwashing is the term. If there's a puffery or statements that are in there that are not lending themselves well to verification. And really, companies, I don't think, necessarily set out to do this on purpose. Again, oftentimes the data comes from departments that are not based in the accounting department, and they're not used to the level of internal controls and scrutiny that data does when it comes out through a financial statement system. Obviously, it's very popular these days to look green, to look sustainable. I challenge you almost to find a company that doesn't have at least some website claims, even if they're not publishing a full report. They're somewhere in their materials, whether that's printed, website, or even on the tagline of their signatures, as was mentioned earlier, that it's really just popular right now, and I think that will probably sustain us for quite some time. I don't think this is going to go away. So since there is no requirement on independent verification, not many companies have it done. We are pleased to see that GRI is starting to take note of this a little bit more. They do have, as we mentioned, the plus sign. There certainly is movement afoot from a lot of entities to try to make sure there's some controls, whether that's insistent that there be some type of independent verification or just the awareness that there is a difference between a report that's audited and verified and one that is not. Certainly would help the users of these documents and of these claims. Because I do practice in this area, I have a collection of reports, and I'm usually looking for especially some of the larger U.S. companies. And I have to say, when I found this, I had to borrow it for presentations that I make because I could not have said this better myself. The accuracy of the environmental and social data may be lower than that of data obtained through our financial systems. And Shell Oil, unfortunately, does not have their corporate sustainability report audited. And I had to give my hat off to them, that they're right out there admitting that perhaps, this data isn't necessarily going to stand up to the type of audit that our financial statements would. But it's a true statement, and you can only imagine if, for those of you that are auditors in the room, if you went out to your client and you were told that, well, we don't really have any internal controls around this number, and by the way, nobody's really reviewed or monitored or checked for accuracy, and we've never had it audited. I mean, you're probably going to put that as a high-risk area and expect to have some audit adjustments there. So if you kind of use that analogy, I think that that's what you would find in companies that typically don't have robust internal control systems, and yet they're out there, they're putting out the corporate sustainability reports. I listed here a few things. Obviously, GRI dominates the space, as Mike mentioned, and we've learned about that today. That certainly is quickly becoming the go-to set of standards for companies that are initially putting together their corporate sustainability reports. Even companies that don't profess to follow GRI or mention GRI still use GRI as guidelines. So it is definitely generally accepted, I think, throughout the world. But there's also a lot of other places to go to get these standards for companies that are interested in putting this information together, and I've listed a few here. Now, when an auditor goes about auditing this type of report, there really are no generally accepted, shall we say, auditing standards for CSR reports. My firm typically prefers to use GAAS, G-A-A-S, Generally Accepted Auditing Standards in the U.S. That could easily be modified for international standards if need be, very similar criteria there. And we use AT 101, so other attestation engagement. I wanted to just close, just again trying to summarize some of the areas that you may run into this as regulators. When you look at what the CPA services are in this area today, some of the more common would be auditing a full-blown CSR report. Now, that can be done in whole. Keep in mind that a CSR report may have 100 different types of metrics in it. Most commonly, companies are choosing to have their CPAs pick out just a few that they would opine on, maybe the ones that are most near and dear to their business mission, and then over the years layer in some more as they get more robust internal controls. So you can see kind of a wide range of that audit opinion covering the entire report to covering perhaps just a few of the assertions or the key performance indicators that are listed in that report. Greenhouse gas emissions is almost its own entire topic. My personal choice when I am engaged to certify or verify the GHG report is to do that under AT 101 as a review. This can run the gamut for product certifications. Again, oftentimes we are engaged to go in and look at just the systems, the internal control structure that's leading up to that report. Whether that's a system or a certification of just some of the product lines. So you can see there's just a wide variety of ways that audit services can be performed in here. And of course, I haven't even touched on the consulting type of aspects that come along with this as well. Internal control review, too, just is a big area where the accountant would have a lot of variety on how they would structure that report to go in and do an internal controls review, whether that's related to Attest or related to consulting services. So that is all I had, just to give you a quick summary on what you might be seeing as regulators in the coming years.
Well, thank you, Laurie, and the other panelists. A lot to think about here. Let me tell you that I think some of you know I have mentioned that I've been involved on the what is called the CAG, the Consultative Advisory Group of the International Auditing and Assurance Standards Board. And the first meeting that I attended several years ago, and I was all prepared to go in and talk about the auditing standards that I'm so familiar with in the financial area, confirmations and verification, all of the financial statements, all of that kind of good stuff. And when I got there, the first thing I saw was something called a GHG standard. And what's a GHG? And I called Laurie, that's greenhouse gas standard on sustainability, and I didn't know anything about it, so I knew that Laurie did some of those sorts of reports, so it's brand new to me. You've been presented with a lot of things to think about. Why don't you mull that over in your mind? We have a little clip that we wanted to play. Anthony, do you have that ready to run? Did I say Anthony? Got the Are we okay, there.
Oi, Deborah, how are we going to save the planet today then? A bit of tree hugging, sharing a bath together.
Accountancy, Theo.
Accountancy?
Accounting for sustainability, actually. It's a way for businesses to measure what really matters, like the environmental impact of what they do.
That's a neat idea.
So newspapers can put their carbon emissions on their balance sheets, or a manufacturer can measure its water usage.
And that means...
Exactly. Business people can now become the most effective eco-warriors.
You've got to forget all that long hair and hippy-dippy jumpers, Richard. It's old hat now. It's all about accounting.
Too late, Theo.
Richard, believe me, it's never too late.
I mean, it's too late because we're already doing it. As far as we're concerned, it's like any other aspect of business. Once you've got accurate numbers, you just start to improve them.
Right. Now, I know the sustainability thing's going to cost you a few bob, Stuart, but it's got to be worth it if we're going to save the planet, surely.
Well, cost of it, on the contrary, actually it's added over £50 million to our bottom line.
Really?
Absolutely, it's about saving scarce resources, not squandering them.
Hello, Indra.
Hello, Theo. I hear you want to talk about sustainability. You know, it's really important to us at PepsiCo.
Is it?
Yeah, we believe in delivering sustainable growth by investing in a healthier future for people and our planet.
That's great.
We've been involved for 4 years now, so it's really starting to help us embed sustainability in every decision that we make.
So, does that make you green?
Green? Oh no, you mean the Topshop guy. I'm king.
King? I thought it was all about a prince.
Now, saving the planet is the business of business. Start accounting for sustainability.
So with that, I'd like to invite anyone to step forward and ask questions of any of our panelists on what you've heard and seen here today. I think our focus ought to be around what does this mean to state boards and what are we going to see in the future from a regulation standpoint. And if you could please state your name and your affiliation.
Thank you very much, Galen. My name is Jim Silf, and I'm with the International Federation of Accountants. I'd like to thank the panel for their presentation, and my question is really more back to the audience than it is to the panelists. What is the competency requirements we expect of the CPA 10 years from now? Because I would submit to you, it is not the examination we give them today. It is going to be something significantly different. And that's the challenge for all those writing examinations and continuing professional development for those of us like you and me, Galen, who've been around a long time, and as you quite rightly said, was suddenly confronted with GHG and had to sound really intelligent by 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and you did. That's very good.
Thank you, Jim.
If I could just say something at that point. I landed back in the U.S. after working and living in Amsterdam for GRI there. And the big 4 accounting firms have helped support us and get us on the ground here. Immediately got some phone calls from IIA and IMA and a few other acronyms that I didn't know at the time. I'm more of an environmental guy, not an accounting kind of guy. Suddenly I'm doing webinars for over 1,000 people. I've never done a webinar for over 1,000 people. I asked the organizers, why are there so many people on this call? I mean, it's great, but it was because of the continuing education requirements. I had no idea that space even existed, so I'm glad to be here, and I want to learn more from you. I'll be here, through lunch and through this afternoon, so please come talk to me about how I can formalize this effort even more.
Sam or Laurie, do you have any feel for I thought we were still going to talk about the next 10 years here. What's going to be required of CPAs down the road?
Yeah, I think that's, can you hear me in the back? My thought is at the present time, I can certainly fit in the requirements to do the audit or the verification or the examination into the existing paradigm of an audit approach. I think that as the standards evolve and there become more concrete standards relating to certain of the corporate social responsibility indicators, especially the greenhouse gas emissions, that may change, but I think at least at the present time, the profession is well equipped to take on these verification services with the audit approach, generally accepted auditing standards that we have today.
Yeah, the thing I would say about it is we were talking about the exam and what the exam might test on these sorts of things. As we all know, the exam is a minimum entrance requirement into the profession, and I think this falls into the area of we need to teach people how to audit and other skills, and then we'll need to have subject matter experts. We'll need to have people that are accountants and engineers, or if they're not engineers, we'll have to have the engineers involved helping us, just as we do currently with fair value or pensions or any of the other specialized areas that we can't teach in any depth or test in any depth on the CPA exam.
Laurie, and please forgive me, I'm going to pursue this for just a second, but your firm is more of a regional, almost national firm. NASBA is a large firm. Are we seeing any activity in this space with smaller practices? When are we going to start seeing things? You said that we're going to see it ultimately at boards of accountancy. When do you think that's going to happen?
I don't think it's going to happen until more large companies choose to have their reports or the systems that lead into the reports audited. Right now, there's not enough clients to go around, so to speak. So the big four, some of the larger firms, and there definitely are some small boutique firms that are involved in this, but it's really the firms that have taken the interest and taken the proactive step of teaching themselves the issues, getting involved in entities like GRI committees. The AICPA has a number of sustainability-related committees, and really getting involved in the industry, even if they only have one client. I mean, that's really what we're seeing, where there's just a few clients spread out amongst a few firms, and we're all learning together. But I just can't predict when it will happen. I do think it will happen someday, especially when you look to other countries where there are actually requirements, or it's just much more popular or common for the companies to hire the equivalent of a CPA or a chartered accountant to do that work.
Thanks, Laurie. Yes, when we heard the presentation of Barry Melanson and also Ken Bishop in the discussion about the definition of a test, broadening that definition, I think it really makes you think about that in connection with what we've been talking about here today. You had a question now. Thank you.
People are all tall. I'm Kitty Pumphrey, and the Idaho Board denies any association with me. My question is kind of a follow-up to his question, except instead of looking at 10 years, I'm looking at tomorrow. Laurie, where does your firm find peer reviewers who are actually capable of peer reviewing this type of report?
Well, and keep in mind, if you were to open the audit binder for one of my CSR clients, it is going to look identical to the audit binder for a financial statement audit. We do planning, we do risk assessment, we test internal controls, We determine in advance which internal controls we can rely upon, and which ones we're going to actually not rely upon. We'll test effectiveness and then move on to the substantive testing for the numbers that are in the report. So at this point, it's and this is, I think, what a lot of people struggle with. It's not any different. You know, a number that's in there for a social factor is still a number that hopefully has a robust internal control system behind it, supporting it, that management has reviewed and approved and reported on. And there has to be criteria identified. There's no way a CPA can go in and issue an attestation engagement without knowing what the criteria is. So it's very important that that criteria either be documented in the report itself, which is normally what I prefer to do, so it's very transparent, or at the very least spelled out clearly in the engagement letter and in the work papers that support that audit.
Kevin, yeah.
Thanks, Gillen. I just really wanted to get back to the definition of attest and broadening that issue. I think when you look at the issue of attestation, that is the sweet spot of this profession. I think as we look forward, whether it's 5 years or 10 years down the road in this particular area, Sam talked about hiring subject matter experts, engineers, scientists, etc., really to back up the CPAs doing this work, because they really don't have all that expertise on their own. And an equally viable business model out there is that the engineers hire the subject matter experts, the CPAs, who can do the attest work. And I think as you think about this evolving down the road, there are other people who are going to get into this space and try and claim this space if the accounting profession does not get its arms around it, and that's just a business issue that we have to think about.
I would like to point out, because it's so fresh here in the U.S., we were asked to do a study, and this is, note the clip there and the big draft along it. I'm looking currently at the 26 reports that have had some sort of attestation in the U.S., and analyzing right now what all this means to us, but also to the community. You're right, there's a lot of players coming into this. It kind of goes to the greenwash statement as well. Suddenly, this is the next sexy thing to be involved in, so everyone's jumping on this bandwagon. So I don't know if you've heard of these organizations, but NSF and Underwriters Laboratories, wide range of entities, ISO, they're all playing around this space right now. It's going to harmonize itself, but we don't know how it's going to harmonize itself.
Dan?
Yeah, Dan Sweetwood, I'm the executive director of the Nebraska State Board. And as a regulator, this is a little scary too, but we, in our state, we monitor civil litigation. And we have seen a little bit of, we have several cases that we're monitoring now regarding wealth management in that area. And I'm thinking specifically to you, Laurie, as a board member, how do you perceive the future? As state boards is monitoring civil litigation in this area, as that comes, the risk and some of those things to firms and CPAs.
Thank you, Dan. I think that's a good point, because I think that that's where you will first start to see this in your state boards, because there's no oversight over the reports or oversight over the auditors issuing those reports, because of the lack of the required standards. I think that where we'll see, ironically, this will probably lead to more of the need for the CPA services, but when we start to see some civil litigation with companies being sued because they haven't been living up to their word, the greenwashing has occurred, and now there's a lawsuit in play, that may actually lead to the need or the opportunity for CPAs to do more of the verification. It might help companies decide that they'd like the verification. But I think that's also where you're going to start to see that come in front of the state board if you have a situation where a report has been verified or some form of examination, and then a lawsuit occurs after that. Of course, the CPA at that point is going to be swept into it. So that is very likely the first wave that you would be seeing as state regulators.
Well, I'd like to thank our panelists for being here today and informing us on something that we're going to see a lot more of in the future.